My fellow citizens, there are moments in history when the clock ticks louder, when time doesn't simply pass, it erupts, moments when the ordinary rhythm of life is shattered, and in just 24 hours a nation is jolted awake. There are moments in history when the world shifts in a single day. What seemed permanent becomes fragile. What we took for granted begins to unravel. These are the kinds of moments that redefine how a people see themselves and how a nation understands its place in the world. The speech opens with the idea that time, usually steady and unnoticed, can suddenly become sharp and deafening. Within just 24 hours, an event can erupt with such intensity that it rattles not only institutions, but also the very soul of a country. This point speaks to the power of a single day to become a turning point, where everything that comes after is forever different from everything that came before. Throughout history, we've seen how a single moment can ripple outward to shape generations. Whether it's a sudden tragedy, a bold act of resistance, or a spark of collective unity, the force of change can arrive without warning. In those 24 hours, the illusion of comfort is replaced with an undeniable urgency. People begin to see clearly, perhaps for the first time, that things are not as stable or just as they once believed. And in that clarity, there is both pain and possibility. The speech urges listeners to recognize that transformation doesn't always unfold over decades. Sometimes it comes crashing down all at once, pulling the blindfold from our eyes and asking us to look honestly at who we are. These kinds of days serve as a mirror, reflecting back not only the brokenness in systems and leadership, but also the resilience and determination buried deep within the people. It becomes a test, a moment of reckoning that asks whether we will be bystanders to history or participants in its rewriting. This first key point is about more than just a dramatic event. It's a reminder that change is often unexpected, and that awareness can arrive like a lightning bolt. The 24 hours referenced are symbolic of those rare and powerful shifts that jolt us out of apathy. They ask us to feel, to think, to move. And once we are shaken awake by such a moment, we cannot go back to sleep. That one day becomes the line in the sand, the beginning of something greater, something deeply human, and something that cannot be ignored. In the speech, there is a powerful recognition that while those 24 hours were filled with shock and disruption, they also brought something deeper to the surface, truth. Painful, uncomfortable, and often buried truths rose like a wave, making it impossible for anyone to look away. The chaos didn't just tear at the edges of normal life. It peeled back the layers that had long covered up injustice, inequality, and systemic failures. What had once been hidden or accepted as just the way things are suddenly stood exposed, raw and undeniable. That exposure wasn't just a moment of crisis. It was a moment of clarity. When a nation is shaken like that, people begin to see more clearly. The familiar narratives start to crumble, and questions that were once whispered begin to be shouted. Why is this happening? Who has been unheard? Who has been unseen? These questions don't come from politicians or headlines alone. They come from the people themselves, awakened by a sudden confrontation with reality. The speech frames this moment not only as one of heartbreak, but of realization. It acknowledges the pain of seeing what has long been ignored, but emphasizes the necessity of that awakening. This kind of collective realization becomes the beginning of a shift in consciousness. It spreads across communities, cutting through indifference and forcing people to wrestle with their own roles, their own responsibilities. The moment reveals not only the flaws in external systems, but also the ways we, as individuals, may have accepted or ignored them. It brings with it a kind of moral urgency, a call to act, to speak, to rethink what justice and dignity really mean in practice. What makes these 24 hours so transformative is that they don't just shake a government or an institution, they awaken a people. That awakening is not quiet or passive, it's loud, it's restless, it challenges the status quo and refuses to return to sleep. In this sense, the speech delivers a powerful message. The pain that erupts in a single day is not the end, it is the beginning. It is the birth of a more aware, more conscious society, and once that awareness has been sparked, it becomes a fire that cannot be extinguished. That is the real power of truth. It may arrive painfully, but it never leaves things as they were. The speech emphasizes a fundamental belief. Real power has always belonged to the people. It does not lie solely in the hands of those in office or behind the walls of institutions. True strength emerges when individuals come together, find their voices, and take action. In the 24 hours that shook the nation, people who once felt unheard or invisible suddenly realized their power, not as isolated individuals, but as a unified force. Their voices, raised in pain and determination, became louder than the noise of denial or dismissal. The speech makes it clear that awakening is not just about awareness. It's about action, and action begins with people realizing the weight of their own voice. During those critical hours, silence gave way to speech. Those who had been quiet out of fear, exhaustion, or hopelessness began to speak with clarity and courage. It was not the voice of a few that changed the tone of the nation, but the collective outcry of many. They did not wait for permission. They did not ask for a perfect plan. They simply stood up and said, "Enough. This kind of unity is powerful because it is rooted in truth. It's not orchestrated by leaders from above, but driven by lived experience from below." That's where real momentum begins, on the ground, among neighbors in communities across generations. The speech draws attention to the fact that change doesn't come from hope alone. It comes from people doing the work, side by side with purpose. It comes when individuals realize that even if they feel small, together they are mighty. The belief that ordinary people can drive extraordinary change has always been the engine behind every major step forward. This moment in the speech celebrates that principle, not just as a hopeful idea, but as a visible reality during that 24-hour turning point. As the people rose, so did a new kind of power, one that cannot be silenced by force or erased by policy. It is the power of conviction, of unity, of relentless demand for something better. The speech reminds us that systems only have as much control as people are willing to give them. Once the people stand up, once they awaken and move with shared purpose, there is no system, no institution, no status quo strong enough to hold them back. That is the heartbeat of transformation. The speech recognizes that while awakening is powerful, it is only the beginning. Change, especially the kind that transforms a nation, is never quick or easy. It requires persistence, patience, and a willingness to face discomfort. The moment of awakening during those 24 hours brought a surge of energy and urgency, but sustaining that momentum demands something deeper. It demands commitment. The speech doesn't romanticize change. It presents it as hard, unglamorous work that stretches across weeks, months, even years. It tells us that transformation doesn't happen with a single speech, a single protest, or a single policy. It happens through consistent effort, even when progress is slow and the path is uncertain. When a nation is shaken, there is often a burst of emotion: anger, grief, determination. But what comes next is a test. The emotional wave eventually settles, and people are left with choices. Will they keep showing up? Will they keep listening, organizing, voting, building, and healing? Or will they let exhaustion turn into apathy? The speech speaks to this tension. It honors the initial spark, but also challenges people to carry that spark forward, even when it becomes tiring or inconvenient. Real change demands not only moments of bravery, but a lifetime of effort. It asks people to stay engaged long after the cameras are gone and the headlines have faded. The speech also reminds listeners that progress is rarely linear. There will be setbacks, resistance, and times when it feels like nothing is improving, but those are the moments when persistence matters most. The struggle is not a sign of failure. It is a necessary part of the process. Healing, especially in a deeply divided or wounded society, does not happen overnight. It involves truth, telling, accountability, forgiveness, and sometimes rebuilding from the ground up. It requires people to trust each other again and to believe that the future can be better than the past. Rather than offering empty promises, the speech offers honesty. Change is painful, it's messy. It forces us to confront parts of ourselves and our history that we'd rather ignore. But the message is clear: that pain has purpose. The effort, though exhausting, is worth it. Because when a people commit to the long, difficult work of change, they don't just shift laws. They shift culture, values, and generations. That is how a nation truly begins to transform. The speech makes it clear that the responsibility for shaping the future does not rest solely on the shoulders of leaders, politicians, or public figures. It belongs to all of us. In the aftermath of the 24 hours that shook the nation, the question is not just what happened, but what each individual is willing to do about it. Moments of crisis often expose the need for leadership, but the kind of leadership that truly drives progress often rises from within the people. The speech challenges every listener to stop waiting for someone else to fix things and to instead recognize their own role in creating change. It is easy to point fingers, to blame institutions or systems for what has gone wrong. And while accountability at the top is necessary, lasting change cannot be outsourced. Every citizen, every neighbor, every voice carries weight. The speech calls for a shift in mindset, from passive observers of history to active participants in it. It reminds us that we are not powerless, even when the problems seem too big or too deeply rooted. The moment we realize that our choices, our actions, and even our silence contribute to the state of the world, we begin to understand the depth of our responsibility. This responsibility is not about doing everything alone. It's about doing something meaningful, no matter how small it seems. Whether it's educating ourselves, having difficult conversations, voting with intention, or showing up for our communities, the speech insists that each action matters. Waiting for the perfect moment or the perfect plan is a luxury we can no longer afford. Change is urgent, and it starts with those willing to take the first step. The speech speaks to a truth many try to ignore, that inaction is also a decision. Choosing to stay silent or uninvolved allows injustice and inequality to thrive. By reminding listeners that the future is not written by a few, but by the many, the speech instills a deep sense of duty. This is not a call to perfection, but a call to presence, to showing up consistently and courageously. When people take ownership of their collective destiny, they become the authors of the future. And in that shared responsibility, they find strength, purpose, and the power to build a better tomorrow. The final message of the speech is a powerful call to remain awake, aware, and engaged beyond the moment of crisis. When a nation is shaken and a people are awakened, it is not the end of the journey. It is only the beginning. The danger lies not in the pain of those 24 hours, but in the temptation to return to comfort and forget the urgency that moment revealed. The speech warns that once eyes have been opened to truth, injustice, and the need for change, going back to sleep, mentally, morally, and civically, is not an option. The true test of awakening is whether people stay alert when the headlines fade, when the crowds disperse, and when it's no longer popular to speak out. There is a rhythm to history. It surges and settles, and far too often, people rise only during the surge. The speech pushes back against this cycle by urging listeners to stay ready, to keep the energy alive even when the moment becomes quiet again. This readiness is not about fear or paranoia. It is about staying grounded in purpose. It means building habits of engagement, paying attention to what's happening in our communities, holding leaders accountable, and nurturing the values that were so vividly brought into focus during that critical moment. The message here is clear. Awakening is not just a feeling, it is a responsibility. Being awake means continuing to ask hard questions, continuing to act with courage, and refusing to let complacency dull the clarity that crisis brought. The speech urges people not to wait for another catastrophe to remind them of their power. It's a reminder that history is not something that just happens. It is something that is shaped by those who choose to stay involved. Remaining awake means understanding that change is not a single victory or a dramatic turning point, but a series of daily decisions. It's in the quiet effort, the consistent showing up, the refusal to be distracted or disheartened by setbacks. The speech gives voice to the idea that an awakened people, once stirred to action and purpose, cannot and must not return to sleep. Because the moment we close our eyes again, the moment we forget what we saw, is the moment we risk repeating the same mistakes. Staying awake is the only path to real, lasting transformation.